In the trenches, where the customers talked about the state of comics and debated the minutiae of the characters and universes they loved, despite the way they would sometimes express that love through rage, was the retailer, trying desperately to survive the madness that the industry had gone through. And on those front lines was Chuck Rozanski of Mile High Comics. Rozanski, a self-described counterculture capitalist, was one of the earliest direct market retailers of comics, opening his first store in 1974. Originally, new comics were just a means of generating foot traffic, as the cover price meant that the profit margin on each book was minuscule, 6 cents an issue, about 28 cents today adjusted for inflation. But thanks to the introduction of a new comic distribution system specifically for these growing shops, new issues arrived a week or more before it appeared on the newsstands, so that foot traffic could be relied upon, which generated interest in where the real money was, back issues. It wasn't long before Rozanski had 4 mile-high shops and was operating a successful mail-order business as well, so he had weathered a few storms before that bubble had burst in the mid-90s. He's written about how the distribution system led to a lawsuit in the late 70s that threatened to bring down Marvel and possibly the entire industry, and even was invited by Marvel executives to share his views directly with them about the flaws in the entire distribution system that had existed at that time, which essentially was costing both Marvel and the retailers sales due to lack of information on upcoming titles and not being able to purchase on credit. During the visit, he was introduced to the whiz kid that was turning Marvel around editorially, improving the overall quality of the books and keeping them on a regular schedule. Yes, I'm once again talking about Jim Shooter. Shooter himself had already been examining the figures and, after discussing it with Rozanski, had championed reforming the distribution system. Based on those decades of experience, Rozanski has put forth the theory that the health of the comic market can be measured by the health of Marvel. And with uncertainty as to whether or not the company would be completely dissolved, it was a sign the market was on life support. Rozanski had also mentioned a degree of guilt in how the actions that they took to transition the industry from newsstands to direct market stifled the introduction of new readers, who had previously all first been exposed through newsstands. I can personally attest that the comics at the pharmacy, grocery store, and 7-Eleven were how I first entered the hobby and my only means of acquiring books until I was old enough to drive and trusted enough to make the half-hour trip to our nearest comic book store. Carl Icahn, who had finally gotten his hands on Marvel, now publicly spoke about this, actually, saying that the books should be back on the newsstands, with a cover price of around 60 cents. And theoretically, it probably would have been feasible if the books were considered an acceptable loss to make the licensing more profitable through this relentless public exposure, though it still would have been difficult. Magazine distributors have never liked handling them. They cost just as much for them to deal with as any magazine, but they're only worth a fraction of the price, and so consequently a fraction of the money. But it was probably just talk. A lot of talk was taking place, and consequently, a lot of frenzied action at Marvel under the leadership of Bob Harras. Like Shooter, Harras was often criticized for his interference, but unlike Shooter, he was rarely defended because of positive results, because few were to be had. Many felt that he needed to be like Sir Humphrey Appleby of the British show Yes, Minister, the one who kept things running because ministers come and ministers go, but the business of government needs to have a steady direction to it. Likewise, Harras, in the minds of many, should have been the one developing the policies and directions to restore Marvel while placating the new boss just long enough for them to be replaced. But with every change dictated by the new management, Harras would change direction to accommodate them, the result being chaos behind the scenes. It was understandable. DeFalco and Shooter had both been fired, and right now there were constant layoffs. Rocking the boat risked him likewise being sacked. Now add in Harris's insistence on meddling, including his announcement that writer-driven comics were an experiment that failed. Factor in the number of people who had quit because of his creative interference, and Bob Harras had replaced Ron Perlman as the devil in the minds of many. An amusing turn of events took place when one of Harris's decrees came down. "We need to bring back Howard the Duck," he said. Tom Brevoort, who handled Spider-Man special projects like The Final Adventure, was in charge because Harras wanted to bring him back in yet another Spider-Man team-up book. Well, everyone Brevoort talked to said that the only one who could do it justice would be Steve Gerber, Howard's creator and probably the man who hated Marvel more than anyone alive. If this is Marvel Knights, Steve Gerber is Don Quixote. Well, Gerber was doing an issue for Image where his creation, Destroyer Duck, crosses paths with Erik Larsen's Savage Dragon, and so he had an idea. What if the Marvel book and the Image book could both meet in the same location? Now, not a team-up or anything, just the two groups stumbling across each other so it would create a larger tapestry when both books would be viewed together. Brevoort thought it sounded interesting, so all he asked was that Gerber not do anything that was going to get Brevoort in trouble. And Gerber was sincere in that. At the time. But then the other shoe dropped. Harris was planning to start using Howard all over the place. Gerber was expecting this to be some kind of blast from the past, not to kick off a revival so that the character could hang out with Ghost Rider, and he sure as hell didn't want it implied that he was giving that his blessing. There was nothing Brevoort could do about that. Nothing except let Gerber out of the agreement if that's how he felt about it. Well, they weren't getting off that easily, not with all of the history between Marvel and Gerber. Instead, what he set up was a visit to a place that was full of Duck clones, which Howard entered from the Marvel side, and Destroyer entered from Gerber's side, and then both walked out of Gerber's side, with the Duck clone heading out the Marvel side, thinking that he was Howard the Duck. Essentially, Gerber rescued Howard away from Marvel and then replaced him with a clone. No doubt chosen given the Clone Saga mess that was going on and on and on, in part thanks to Harris's meddling. Unfortunately for Gerber, this was a hollow victory, but I'll get more into that next time. By now, Perelman was out of the picture, so the struggle was between Icon and Toy Biz, each courting support from the banks. Of the two, Toy Biz was the less likely bet, but Icon would be worse news for Marvel. The more he got into it, the more he realized he had massively misjudged Perelman's behavior. He wasn't playing up Marvel's problems, he had actually been downplaying them. At this point, he was only in it for two reasons: to recover his losses, and to avoid looking like a chump who was outfoxed by a small-time toy company. And Perlmutter at Toy Biz wasn't a saint either. He wasn't a corporate raider, but he'd made his less-than-modest fortune by buying companies that were in trouble and finding ways to trim costs and bargain hard deals. His plan when he took over Marvel was to penny-pinch everything from getting rid of free beverages to insisting they not throw away paper clips, with the coup de grace being his plan to institute a mandatory drug test policy, the kind of thing he would do when he bought out a dollar store to ensure the help weren't tempted to steal from him or laze about. He didn't accept the argument that many creative people would, well, indulge a bit to help their creativity, and that you couldn't treat an Eisner Award-winning creator like a shelf stalker at Dollar Tree. What made Perlmutter the lesser of two evils, though, was his partner, Avi Arad, who was in love with the Marvel Universe. So unlike Icon, there was no chance that Toy Biz was going to do anything to deliberately hurt the company just to make a quick buck. Everything changed when Icon learned that Toy Biz shareholders had been buying up bank debt. You see, in a situation like this, for the banks to agree to a settlement, you needed debtors holding a total of 2/3 of the debt in order to approve it. By buying up 1/3 of it, Toy Biz shareholders and their partners could block any settlement that kept Icon in charge. Icon responded with a declaration of war, suing everybody in sight, including dragging Perlman back into the case by charging that it was his gross mismanagement in order to line his own pockets that led to this mess in the first place, and that Perlmutter and Arad's Toy Biz board was illegitimate and must be dissolved. And your little dog, too! While that was going on, Joe Calamari enters the picture. He was a former Marvel executive. In fact, remember Jim Shooter's children's show script, the one he wouldn't let Marvel have, and they got really pissed off? Well, Joe Calamari specifically was the guy who was getting really pissed off in that meeting. Anyway, he was brought back in by Icon. Well, given the catastrophe that Marvel was, Calamari was doing a lot of networking at the time, and so he wound up at a party run by former Valiant artist Joe Quesada and his longtime collaborator, Jimmy Palmiotti, an inker and writer. Calamari got into a discussion with them about Marvel, and they suggested farming the books out to their studio, Event Comics, but for a great deal less than Liefeld and Lee had been offered for Heroes Reborn. They promised real talent and up-to-date production processes that would make the books look slick, so they were given the job. And it should be noted, it was a very challenging one. They didn't get big names like Avengers and Fantastic Four characters to work with. The 4 books they were given were Daredevil, The Inhumans, Black Panther, and The Punisher. But the 2 young men were connected and fearless, so their new imprint, Marvel Knights, was given all they could. For starters, Director and famed comic book fan Kevin Smith agreed to write Daredevil, with art by Quesada himself, and kicked off a storyline some considered to have been the best the character had seen since the Frank Miller days. Christopher Priest of Quantum and Woody took on Black Panther and turned the character into essentially, what if the king of a powerful, wealthy country had a mind as honed as Batman? Combined with a game of intrigue, the book was frequently listed as the best title you're not reading in comic book shops. Paul Jenkins, who had gotten noticed doing Hellblazer, teamed up with Jay Lee, who had worked for several image studios, creating the miniseries for The Inhumans, whom you might previously have remembered from Who the Hell Are the Inhumans? The book went on to win an Eisner and was part of the reason, no doubt, that the Inhumans went from that marginalized area towards the more mainstream Marvel universe. And The Punisher, while once so popular he had 3 monthly books, had become so overexposed, diluted by copycats, and imploded into irrelevancy. Well, they had a solution for that too. We'll make The Punisher into a supernatural book. Okay, well, 3 out of 4 isn't bad. No problem, they rebooted it again and gave it to Garth Ennis, who restored the character to normal and to much acclaim. Marvel Knights was arguably the point when Marvel Publishing was saved. Even though these were books that nobody would normally give a damn about, they were suddenly worth reading. And if that could happen to the Inhumans, what about the core characters and teams? What if they did it with that? But in the offices, there was understandable rage over Marvel Knights. The point was made by many editors that if they were given the kind of money that Event Comics was getting, they could afford to make goods that looked and read as well as Marvel Knights did. They simply didn't have the budget, the resources, or the managerial support to do it. While Quesada and Palmiotti were trading favors to give the line publicity to make it a huge hit, Bob Harras was hiding in his office, trying to avoid confrontation with a creative force on the edge of revolt. While Marvel Knights was still in the planning stages, a change of judges for the bankruptcy case resulted in the appointment of a trustee to handle Marvel, John J. Gibbons. Gibbons was exploring all options on what to do with Marvel, up to and including selling it piecemeal if that was really the best option. But keeping Marvel intact seemed like the best choice, although they were nevertheless open to taking offers outside of Icon and Toy Biz. And that was when Chuck Rozanski, out in Colorado, watching all of this East Coast chest-thumping silliness that was driving the #1 comic book company to the brink of oblivion, was finding himself pulled into that when he was contacted by Jim Shooter. Remember that this disaster, with hundreds of millions of dollars on the line, happened when his initial bid on the company was beaten by $1.5 million. Since then, he has started and then been fired from his own company, started a second company and had Marvel spitefully destroy it. Now, he had nothing holding him back from giving his undivided attention to the beast as it lay dying, with a chance to finally run Marvel the way he believed it could be. And I'm betting getting a chance to stick it to the people who had screwed him over many, many times probably wasn't a bad way to start the day. Rozanski was hesitant to join Shooter, not because he didn't believe in Shooter's abilities to turn Marvel into success, but rather was unhappy with the idea of heading to New York City for an indeterminate time. Rozanski didn't want to own Marvel. What he did want, though, was to see the comics industry survive, and that meant Marvel needed to survive. So if he could help make that happen, then reluctantly he'd get involved, do his part to get it back on its feet, and then head back to his family, comic book stores, and organic farm. Rozanski, Shooter, and the other partners involved in raising the funds arrived in New York to look over the documents and determine what kind of bid to offer. Rozanski, as the planned marketing director of a new Marvel, was given the documents related to licensing agreements. He quickly realized where the problem was and why Icon was so pissed off at Toy Biz. The deal for eternal use of Marvel for toys royalty-free was both thorough and absurd, costing Marvel so much money in untapped revenue options, it was unbelievable. When Marvel toys came up, the obvious thought was Marvel action figures, of course. But there was more than that out there that was neither being done by Toy Biz nor being offered to anyone else. For instance, you can't have a kite with a picture of Spider-Man on it. You can't have a special Fantastic Four version of the game Uno. You can't put a picture of the Hulk on a drum of Play-Doh, and so on. That, he explained to the others, was why Perlmutter was struggling to get control of Marvel, because Icon wanted to destroy the key to Toy Biz's success. Marvel was worth less than either the two forces were already offering, but they had so much tied up in Marvel already that it was in for a penny, in for a pound. As much as Rozanski and Shooter wanted to fix Marvel, they were up against adversaries willing to go far higher than reason would allow. and largely because of Perelman's short-sightedness. That was one of the issues Gibbons needed to address, whether or not Perelman had behaved criminally in his actions at Marvel. The conclusion was he had done some rather shameful things and made a lot of really, really stupid decisions. But being shameless and stupid in and of themselves is not a crime, so he was off the hook. But Icon wasn't finished, and I have to tell you, I do have mixed feelings about this part. On the one hand, as a person who has loved comic books, I can't tell you how disturbed I am by the shameless behavior that took place because of greed and ego that threatened this American institution. But on the other hand, as a comedian, this is the gift that keeps on giving. See, Icon put forward a motion to exclude Gibbons from this because someone in his firm had done a minor bit of work for Chase Manhattan, who was one of the debtors. And everyone agreed that was a ridiculous bit of legal posturing. It didn't make any sense at all. But the judge ruled that the firm would be excluded, but he would not allow Gibbons himself to be removed, which was troubling because Gibbons needed the support of his firm. So he asked for a writ from a higher court on the issue, which overruled that. So what we wound up with was fighting between Icon, Toy Biz, and the banks, and also fighting between the judge and the very trustee that he had appointed. And I don't just mean this is a bit of conflict. There was open hostility between the two every time they met in court. So understand why people were worried about the future of Marvel, because it had become a complete quagmire. Business had gone into it and had utterly failed. So the government stepped in and had utterly failed. For the Marvel Zombies, this had become the Battle of Yonkers. It seemed nothing could end this strife. And I'm not exaggerating, by the way. If you want to get a hint of the conflict going on here, a solution to this mess finally seemed in place. Toy Biz would take over, and Gibbons offered approval to that. All it needed was for the judge to approve the action. Well, he refused until a higher court lifted the stay that had been in place, even though that was a cart before the horse situation in the minds of everybody. As a longtime creator of four-color drama, everyone agreed that Marvel's was the most drama-filled bankruptcy case they had ever encountered. Well, the upper court finally lifted the stay. So with the writing on the wall, Icon wanted in on a deal to ensure that he recouped at least some of his money and possibly save face. And Gibbons was naturally in favor because any global deal, as it's called, would almost certainly equal a bonus for him. Just when it seemed finished, though, another extension was asked before resolving matters. Yes. Out in Colorado, Chuck Rozanski continued to update fans on the case, concluding, "What an exercise in futility. The lawyers love it, but the rest of us are just so burned out." But all things must end, which we'll see in our next chapter, Villains.